Hello and welcome to the history of the Yu-Gi-Oh card game. Join me as we venture into the dark past to bear witness to the game's earliest years. This is the fourth part of an ongoing series. If you haven't, please check out the previous video. Let's begin, shall we? We left off with Booster 4, where we were introduced to powerful monsters like Axe Raider, Lajin, Mechanical Chaser, and Gemini Elf, as well as Graceful Charity. Power kept creeping in at a rapid rate. Roughly 1 month later, on September 23rd, Konami released Volume 5. Could this set be even better than Booster 4? Let's take a look.
Volume 5.
In the common slots, we have our usual assortment of lackluster, normal, and fusion monsters. Nothing too spectacular. We do have one common spell, Soul Release, which allows you to banish up to 5 monsters from either graveyard. This spell may be a response to Monster Reborn running rampant. We've also got quite a few effect monsters taking up the common slots this time, probably more than ever. However, most of them are useless. A shitload of them allow you to attack your opponent directly, but have abysmal stats, making them pointless. Really, the only two common effect monsters worth talking about are Masked Sorcerer, who allows you to draw a card when you deal battle damage, and White Magical Hat, who essentially does the opposite, makes your opponent discard a random card once receiving battle damage. These two guys are great for the time. It's kind of funny that Konami continued to introduce ways to draw cards without addressing the fact that the amount of ways to easily draw cards had already reached absurd levels. We've got one normal rare card, which is basically a common card that's harder to find. It is Fake Trap, a card that is hilarious at best. Of the rare cards, there are two worth talking about, which just so happen to be the other two trap cards in this set. The first, Anti-Raigeki, seems terrible in that it only works as a response to one specific card, which was limited at the time. However, since draw power was so ridiculous, it's pretty likely that your opponent would at some point use Raigeki if they had it in their deck. Because of this, coupled with the fact that Anti-Raigeki allows you to turn the effect around on your opponent, might make this worth including as a side deck option in my opinion. The other rare trap is Call of Darkness. Again, to modern eyes, this might look useless at first glance. However, I do think this could be pretty useful at the time. It allows you to destroy any monster special summoned with Monster Reborn, which, as we know, was available at 3 and easily recyclable by Magician of Faith. Because of Magician of Faith, Pot of Greed, and Graceful Charity, it's not inconceivable at all that your opponent could use Monster Reborn well over 3 times. That alone might make Call of Darkness worth it. In addition, Call of Darkness is a continuous trap, which seals the deal for me. If you know you're going first, being able to set this might be well worth it. We've got 3 super rares, and all 3 are effect monsters that make up a trio: Sangha of the Thunder, Kazejin, and Suijin. Each of these monsters have the same effect. It allows you to change the attack of an attacking monster to 0. This built-in protection was unheard of at the time. Konami may have realized that 2 tribute monsters were simply not good enough anymore, which could be the reason for this effect. However, even with this effect, these monsters still aren't worth playing in a constructed setting in my opinion. We've got 3 cards printed in both Ultra Rare and Ultra Parallel Rare. Ultra Parallel Rare has both a gold card title and image like Ultra Rares, but also features reflective coating across the entire surface. The 3 Ultra Rares are Tribute to the Doomed, the Cheerful Coffin, and Change of Heart. Tribute to the Doomed has a very simple effect. Discard a card to target one monster on the field and destroy it. However, this card is better than Fissure in that it allows you to destroy face-down cards, so you can safely rid your opponent of a monster without them getting to activate its effect. This is very valuable for getting rid of the all-powerful Magician of Faith. Aside from Graceful Charity, I think this is the first card with a discard cost. That means you need to be strategic in when to use it since it results in you losing card advantage. The Cheerful Coffin allows you to discard 3 monsters from your hand. This is a very weird card because at the time, the only possible use you can get out of this is with Monster Reborn. Even then, it'd be a lot better to simply run Graceful Charity instead. I don't know, I just think this card was probably very useless at the time. The last super rare is Change of Heart, another forbidden card that's ridiculously good now and was ridiculously good then too. Target one of your opponent's monsters and control it until the end phase. The effect is simple. It's easy to see how they didn't foresee this card's power at the time. They probably figured that only being able to use the monster for the remainder of your turn was enough of a hindrance to balance the card. However, this is obviously not the case. For one thing, you could use it to take control of a monster, which you can then sacrifice as tribute fodder for your summoned skull, for instance. In addition, it can be used regardless of whether or not the targeted monster is face up. Because of this, you can take control of your opponent's flip monster and flip it face up to benefit from its effect. However, taking an opponent's face down monster does come with some risk, in that it could simply be a high defense normal monster, so there is some choice and strategy involved with this card. Due to this, there's now more mind games you can play with your opponent. For example, you can set a Gemini Elf to force your opponent to waste their Change of Heart in fear of it being a Man-Eater Bug or Magician of Faith. Despite being overpowered, Change of Heart did invite some additional strategy to the game. Here's what a constructed deck might look like at this point in history. As you can see, the average power level of cards continues to grow.
Booster 5.
Konami released Booster 5 the following month on October 17th. Did it live up to the previous booster, the legendary Booster 4? Whether or not it did, it contained a lot of interesting cards. Let's start with the 2 common trap cards. Just Desserts is a burn card that would see play in many burn decks for years to come, but I don't think the burn strategy was viable enough at this time to worth considering. However, in a limited format, I could see this card being worth including in your deck, even then. Also, a difference in the rules might make it somewhat more viable than you'd think, which I'll talk about later. We've also got Royal Decree, which negates all other trap effects on the field. This effect is quite good, but probably wasn't worth playing because there simply weren't many good trap cards yet. Honestly, Royal Decree came at an unfortunate time because the trap pool was already bad enough, and Royal Decree basically made traps even more worthless. Looking at Royal Decree and Just Desserts side by side, it almost seems like Royal Decree was designed as a response to Just Desserts. Perhaps they overestimated the power of Just Desserts and created Royal Decree as a way to counter it, which does seem like overkill, but you never know. The rest of the commons are all monsters. The normal and fusion monsters aren't worth discussing, so we'll start with the effect monsters. Mysterious Puppeteer allows you to increase your life points at any time a monster is normal or flip summoned to either side of the field. Interestingly, this was almost definitely introduced as a counter to Just Desserts. As we've seen before, Konami did this sort of thing often back then. Machine King is a 1 tribute monster that can pump himself up when other machines are present. Machine King at the time had the 2nd highest attack amongst 1 tribute monsters. Because of this, he was quite popular for those who didn't have 3 summoned skulls. Dragon Seeker allows you to destroy a dragon type monster upon normal or flip summon. This could possibly be worth playing since it was easy to summon Blue Eyes via Monster Reborn at the time. Moving on to the flip monsters, we have Trap Master. Not worth using at the time. As mentioned, trap cards were too uncommon to make this worth it. Needle Ball lets you pay 2,000 life points to deal 1,000 damage to your opponent. If you want to try building a primitive October 1999 burn deck, be my guest. Needleworm is interesting. Upon being flipped, he sends the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck to the graveyard. That's right, with the release of Booster 5, deck destruction is now theoretically possible to play. However, the deck out rules worked differently back then. When a player ran out of cards to draw, they didn't automatically lose. Instead, the player with the lowest amount of life points lost. This is probably one of the reasons that Just Desserts was included with this set. It helps you ensure that you win if your opponent decks out. However, this rule makes deck destruction less viable. I'll discuss this more later. Booster 5 also introduced us to Morphing Jar, another card that could be used in the deck destruction strategy. It also somewhat changed the way the game is played. Morphing Jar forces you to discard your entire hand and draw 5 cards. Thus, it is more advantageous to have fewer cards in your hand when Morphing Jar is activated. This necessitates setting as many cards as possible, which, in turn, makes Harpy's Feather Duster a more worthwhile card. Yes, Booster 5 gave us more draw power. Morphing Jar, along with the aforementioned Needleworm, makes deck destruction technically possible to construct. However, it was virtually impossible to make it work because of the rules in place. If you were to play this deck, you'd most likely be facing someone with a traditional deck focused on attacking. It's highly likely you would take damage, and since you would be playing passively, you most likely would not even be able to inflict much damage on your opponent, even with the help of Just Desserts. Thus, even if you were to make your opponent deck out, you would lose. Deck destruction is really not feasible at the moment. Oh, by the way, there wasn't a single spell card introduced in this set. Here's our October 1999 deck. These decks are getting harder to build without actually testing them. Is there a point where you have too much draw power in your deck? Well, whatever, what's next? Will Konami finally address the issues with the current card pool?
Volume 6.
Welcome to hell. On November 18th, Konami released Volume 6 and thus began the worst Yu-Gi-Oh format of all time. You probably think I'm being hyperbolic, huh? Oh, you have no idea. Let's just get it out of the way. This set introduced us to Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest. Now, you might be thinking, okay, these cards are good, but I think you're exaggerating. Let me explain. This set introduced us to pre-errata Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest. Sangan's original effect was, when this card is placed in the graveyard, add one monster with an attack strength of 1500 or less from your deck to your hand and shuffle your deck. And Witch of the Black Forest original effect was, when this card is placed in the graveyard, add one monster with a defense strength of 1500 or less from your deck to your hand and shuffle your deck. That's right. When this card is placed in your graveyard from anywhere, neither card needs to be on the field to trigger its effect. Thus, when combined with Graceful Charity, you could keep one card and get two searches, which essentially means you get to instantly draw 3 cards. This is better than Pot of Greed. Hell, even the Cheerful Coffin could be turned into a draw 3 card when combined with Sangan and or Witch. Even by themselves on the field, Sangan and Witch will never lose advantage. No matter how it's removed, it doesn't matter. Using any form of removal on an opponent would simply be a waste and might even be detrimental to you. You could have Sangan or Witch kill themselves to get a card, and as long as the opponent has an attack position monster, you can do this whenever you want. Witch of the Black Forest can even retrieve extremely strong monsters such as Summon Skull and Gemini Elf due to their low defense values. Sangan, being dark, can be used in tandem with Crush Card Virus to absolutely devastate your opponent. You could even sacrifice Sangan with Crush Card, search Mask of Darkness, and then use Mask of Darkness's flip effect to get your Crush Card Virus back to use it again. Witch of the Black Forest cannot be used as a medium from Crush Card Virus because her attack value is too high. However, she can search Sangan, so even she could help to satisfy this combo. But no, the Crush Card Virus strategy isn't even close to the best strategy. I'm sure some of you may already know or have even guessed what it is. Exodia. Each piece of Exodia can be searched with Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest. This, combined with the extreme draw power of the format, means that winning with Exodia is extremely easy and could even be done on your first turn with enough luck. Hell, you didn't even need that much luck. Even the absolute best beatdown deck cannot win fast enough to counter this Exodia strategy. This is easily the first tier 0 deck in Yu-Gi-Oh's history and maybe one of the strongest decks ever. Searching with Sangan and Witch was dead simple. Either wall up with them to stall until they're destroyed, possibly even with your own Dark Hole or Tribute to the Doomed, or discard them with Graceful Charity. You could even use the suicide attack method to get your searches faster, especially when you're close to getting all the pieces you need. None of the Exodia cards were limited, so you can play multiple copies of each if you wanted, wall up with them, and even reuse them if needed with Monster Reborn, so even the Exodia parts had a function. If you're facing an Exodia deck of this time with a normal deck, you have no option but to destroy their Sangan and Witch eventually. There weren't any ways to deal with monsters on the field other than sending them to the graveyard. You couldn't banish them or send them back to the hand or deck. If your opponent has 5 searches on the field, it's essentially checkmate. You've already lost. To win, you might need to reduce your opponent's life before this happens. To win, you need to reduce your opponent's life. But this is extremely difficult due to Swords of Revealing Light and other defensive cards. There were but 2 counters to the Exodia deck, Morphing Jar and Needleworm. Since ways to get the Exodia pieces out of the graveyard were practically non-existent, these 2 cards were your only hope. They are absolutely mandatory if you face an Exodia deck from November 1999. It doesn't make for very interesting gameplay. One last thing, there was no hand size limit yet. That wouldn't be introduced until later. You could practically hoard the entire deck in your hand if you want. So yeah, if we were to hold a November 1999 online tournament today, it'd be nothing but Exodia decks. There wouldn't be anything else worth playing. Hey, if I ever get a bigger fan base, maybe we'll even set up a historical Yu-Gi-Oh! Discord and try it. Wouldn't it be hilarious? Just to see how horrible it is. Alright, I guess we'll see what else Volume 6 included besides Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest. Starting with Common, Polymerization is reissued in the set with new artwork, which is good because it was previously only available in starter boxes. There are 2 other effect monsters besides Sangan and Witch. Wow, look at how bad Dragon Piper is. The other one is Cannon Soldier, who is infamous for being involved in one-turn kills. He actually has the first activation effect on a monster ever. He allows you to tribute a monster and inflict 500 damage. As you can imagine, it eventually becomes possible to bring monsters out infinitely, making this extremely lethal. This card is still forbidden in the OCG to this day. There are some lackluster fusions, including Musician King. Look at this guy. What 2 monsters do you think are needed to make him? If you guessed Witch of the Black Forest and Lady of the Faith, you're right. Baby Dragon was introduced here as a normal rare. Not a good card, but nice for fans of the manga. The rare slots are taken up by a variety of monsters with similar effects. They boost attack and lower attack of monsters on the field depending on the attribute. Unfortunately, even for the time, they're too weak to be useful except in very specific circumstances. If they could boost themselves to at least 1900 attack, they'd actually be quite good, and would make element-specific decks a lot better. Thousand Dragon and Great Moth make their debut as a secret rare and a parallel ultra rare. Great Moth is a version of Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth that doesn't take as long to summon. Still bad though. There are 3 super rares, Mindless Radiant, Muka Muka, and Shadow Ghoul. I'm not sure why Mindless Radiant is a super rare. I guess they just don't like to have more than 5 rares. Muka Muka and Shadow Ghoul have interesting effects, but aren't worth it. Shadow Ghoul might have been good if he didn't require a tribute summon, but oh well. This set introduced counter traps for the very first time, and they're all ultra rares. First up is Horn of Heaven. It allows you to tribute a monster of your own to stop a monster summon. Since it requires 2 cards including a monster, it's not really worth it. It's nice to see more trap cards coming out though. Too bad there's absolutely no reason to use this over Trap Hole. Next up is 7 Tools of the Bandit. It allows you to pay 1,000 to negate the activation of a trap card. For the time, pretty good. Since there still aren't many good traps though, it's not worth using. I guess maybe to stop a Royal Decree. Magic Jammer is similar, except that it requires you to discard. Discarding and paying 1,000 life points are not even comparable. Discarding is a much heavier cost. That being said, it might be worth using to stop Graceful Charity in this format. I'll let you guys decide. Finally, we have Solemn Judgment. Wow, talk about a great card. It allows you to pay half your life points to negate a monster summon or a spell trap activation. Paying half of your life points is nothing if it stops your opponent from doing anything. This is easily the best trap card yet. Maybe this is why they introduced 7 Tools of the Bandit. Crazily enough, this probably isn't even the best card in the set when you take into account the time that it came out. Sandgan and Witch were more immediately impactful since they, basically broke the game. Here's what an optimal deck might look like. Welcome to the Race to Exodia format. This is a monstrosity. The game was not good in this state. Would anyone disagree? After the release of Volume 6, Konami quickly realized how badly things were going and fixed everything. Nah, just kidding. They didn't do shit.
Booster 6.
Booster 6 released on December 1st, 1999. We're approaching the end of the year, folks. This set isn't anything special for the time. Like the boosters preceding it, we have 5 rares, with the rest of the cards being common. The 5 rares are reprints of the rares from the previous set. We've got 1 new continuous trap, Magical Thorn. It causes your opponent to lose 500 life points anytime they discard. This could possibly be a response to Graceful Charity, albeit one that sucked. In this set, we see that Konami recognized why vanilla fusion monsters aren't good. They're too hard to summon since they require specific combinations of cards. As a result, we've got more effect monsters than usual. Goddess with the Third Eye, Mystical Sheep number 1, Versago the Destroyer, and Beast King of the Swamps are the first fusion substitute cards. Now that these guys exist, it's slightly easier to bring out the fusion monster you want. The other monster, of course, must be correct. But this wasn't well known when these cards came out, because the original Japanese text read something like this. You can use this card as a substitute for 1 fusion material monster. The text was very vague in regard to the ruling, so the vast majority of players thought you could, for example, use 2 Mystical Sheep to summon Black Skull Dragon. Gale Dogra allows you to pay 3,000 life points and send a fusion monster to the graveyard, presumably so you can bring them back with Monster Reborn. Yes, this was a perfectly legal maneuver at the time. Restrictions on this came later. The cost is a bit heavy though. You need to bring out a weak monster in attack position, have a Monster Reborn, and pay a decent amount of life points. Monster Eye allows you to pay 1,000 life points and fetch a polymerization from your graveyard. Is this the first specific searcher there is? I might be forgetting, but I think so. You can use this card as many times as you like, as long as you pay the cost, and it can also be retrieved with Witch or Sandgan, so it's actually pretty damn good. Plus, you can use Graceful Charity to put polymerizations in the graveyard, which you can then get back with Monster Eyes, so it's very good value, actually. The most infamous card in this set is probably Cyberstein. He allows you to pay 5,000 life points to summon any fusion monster. At the time, this was the most efficient way to get out a fusion monster with the least amount of cards. Of course, because of the cost, you could usually only do this once per duel. Still, it could definitely help if you're faced with a special summoned Blue Eyes or even a pesky Gemini Elf, and summoning Black Skull Dragon for the final killing blow must have been extremely satisfying. Later on, like Cannon Soldier, this card becomes involved in various OTKs and is eventually banned. There are 2 flip monsters. Penguin Soldier has the first return to hand effect. I think this card was designed around the other cards in the set that allowed you to easily bring out fusion monsters. Sending them to grave isn't necessarily that detrimental due to Monster Reborn being readily available. We know that Konami likes to introduce counters to other cards in the set, so that might have been their thinking. Either way, this is a pretty decent card. Green Kappa is the other flip monster, and he's also pretty good. He destroys 2 set spell or trap cards when flipped. Now that trap cards are starting to get better, he could see some use later on. Finally, there are 4 spells. Restructure Revolution is interesting in that it might be a response to Exodia decks running rampant. Like I said before, there was no hand size limit. Regardless, this card isn't very good. Fusion Sage is cool though, it's another card that searches for polymerization. Booster 6 is intriguing to me. Due to this set, fusion decks actually became possible for the first time. Even though it doesn't seem like it, Konami seems to be getting better with designing cards with the game in mind. Before this set, most of the cards introduced in the other sets actually existed before the rules of the card game were set in stone. The reason I think this to be the case is because many of the cards, even powerhouses like Gemini Elf, were already in the first 2 Game Boy games, which were being developed before the card game came out, and before the expert rules were introduced. And other cards were already in the manga. However, in this set, we see a lot of brand new cards that were introduced with the OCG rules in mind. These cards were created solely for the benefit of the Yu-Gi-Oh! OCG, and not for the manga or video games. I'm having a hard time explaining what I mean, but I'm sure you guys understand. You know, maybe I should have saved these thoughts for later, since the game was in a dismal state in December 1999. Since cards take months to develop, print, and ship, these fusion support cards were likely designed before the Exodia decks became what they were. But surely we won't have to wait months for the game to be fixed, right? Right? Optimal deck hasn't really changed. If you want though, you can use Cannon Soldier to cycle through your Sand Cannon Witches while damaging your opponent. You're probably going to win off of Exodia anyway though.
Shonen Jump and Forbidden Memories.
On December 7th, a Shonen Jump promo card came out, Dark Magician. On December 9th, 1999, Konami released Yu-Gi-Oh! True Duel Monsters, Sealed Memories, known simply as Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories in other regions. I might talk about the video games more in another series, so for now, let's talk about the promo cards that came out alongside it. Harpy's Pet Dragon, Metal Morph, Metal Zoa, Red Eye's Black Metal Dragon, and Zoa. Red Eye's Black Metal Dragon and Metal Zoa are way too cumbersome to get out and are pretty much pointless beyond being collector's items. But hey, that's perfectly fine. Don't forget, then, and still today, a lot of people simply wanted to collect the cards they saw in the manga. In fact, probably most people who bought the game back then bought just to collect their favorites. 5 days later, on December 15th, the starter guide for the game came out. Included with it is Black Magic Ritual. Yes, we can finally summon our Magician of Black Chaos that we received at Tokyo Dome.
EX Starter Box.
2 days later, on December 16th, the EX Starter Box came out. And surprise, I actually have it right here with all the original contents intact. So finally, I can do something special for you guys. I can actually physically show you the cards in one of these videos. In this box are essentially the first ever starter decks in the OCG. I don't count the original starter box because they didn't really make a cohesive deck. There's 2 decks in here, one based on Yugi's and one based on Kaiba's. Once I show off these decks, they're going to look very familiar to some of you, and that's because these decks later made up the Yugi and Kaiba starter decks that were later released in the TCG. Well, kind of. Those decks are based on a version of these decks that released in another box later, the starter box EXR. I also have that, and once we get that far into the timeline, I'll show that one as well, and I'll compare the original starter box EX, the starter box EXR, and the Yugi and Kaiba starter decks, which I also have. Stay tuned for that. For now, I'm just going to show you what's inside this box. Let's do it. First up, we have the 3rd version of the rules book. Although this is the 3rd version, we're still on the expert rules. For those of you who've seen my starter box video, this book looks similar. Eventually, I'd like to work with a translator so I can get accurate translations of all the stuff with you guys. I do study Japanese and I know the characters, but I'm not exactly a translation expert. Still, prior to this video, I did my best to translate this book, and I'm going to be pointing out all the interesting stuff that I saw. This 3rd section here teaches you how to play, and the 5th line here actually describes the ante rule that I mentioned in a previous video. Basically, it says that if you want to, you can bet a card with your opponent before a duel. The 6th rule says that you can't use a card you won in a duel in the following duels of the match. The 7th rule says that you can also bet star chips if you'd like, but you should pre-discuss this beforehand, obviously. The next page here says that you can use 40 or more cards. I think that it says you can subtract the betting card from this and thus use a 39 card deck. There wouldn't be a deck limit for many years to come. It also says that you can prepare a 10-card side deck. Other than 10 cards, side decks work the same. The fourth section here describes the victory conditions. Nothing interesting here. It does mention Exodia. There's some more rules here in the fifth section. The rules here actually require you to say hello and shake hands with your opponent. I guess they didn't care about COVID. Other than that, it's basic stuff. Shuffle your deck, make sure you put your fusion monsters in the fusion deck. You can cut your opponent's deck, show your opponent that you have 10 side deck cards, etc. Play rock, paper, scissors to determine who plays first, stuff like that. The 13th page here describes a part of the ante rule that I think I mentioned in another video. You're supposed to remove the top card of your opponent's deck and place it elsewhere, face down, and vice versa, and that's the card you would play for. You weren't allowed to draw a card on your first turn besides the initial 5, by the way. Don't forget, it also mentions that along with the different phases. There is something on the next page that I translated that confused me. I think it says that you can only have 5 magic and trap cards on the field at once, which makes sense. But I believe it also says that this includes field spells. This is weird because there's a specific field zone, even back then, so I don't know why this would have been the case. Hopefully someone watching this can let me know. This page also lists another difference in the rules that I never knew about. It says that when you activate an equip card, you're supposed to place it on top of the affected monster. However, it falls within the 5-card limit, so this doesn't really change anything. There's another minor thing I never mentioned or realized. Main Phase 2 wasn't a named thing. This book just says that you can go back to your main phase after your battle phase, or you can end your turn. You can't have 2 battle phases though, so it's effectively not any different. You can see in this diagram that it puts the battle phase inside of the main phase. That's what this red thing here is. The red thing's the main phase, and then this is the battle phase within it. So the main phase was just one big thing. There wasn't a main phase 1 and 2, but you did go through your main phase twice. So like I said, basically the same thing. It's just a different way of thinking about it. The section 2 here talks about how to summon fusion monsters. There's nothing too out of ordinary here, but it does tell you what to do if a fusion summoned monster is returned to your hand, which is something I wondered about earlier. It also specifically tells you that Trap Hole doesn't affect monsters that are fusion summoned. Chapter 4 here talks about the expert rules. It says they remove the element of luck and expands the possibility of combos. Page 39 has something interesting. Remember how I said that people would put Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth and Gate Guardian into the graveyard with Graceful Charity in order to summon them with Monster Reborn? Well, the 4th section here specifically forbids that. You can only do that if they're first special summoned, which is something we know now. This is the first time that rule was officially stated. The Q&A is all pretty basic stuff. There's some questions about how specific cards work, but they all work the same as today, so there's nothing really worth mentioning here. And then we just have a place for notes, and that's basically it. What's next in the box? They also provided 2 dual fields. It was nice of them to give 2. Like I mentioned in the starter box video, I think they give you way more stuff than they would nowadays. And now on to the most exciting part, the actual decks, YuGiOh and Kaiba. I'm going to take the time to sort through these for you guys. There's some impactful and very important cards in here that I'll discuss once I'm done flipping through the cards. So please feel free to skip ahead to this timestamp if you don't care to see the cards sorted through. Maybe some of you will recognize the cards in these decks that aren't in the TCG starter decks, and by extension, the EXR set that the TCG sets were based on. I'll talk about that in a later video too. When I show you the EXR set, I'll compare them all. Let's start with YuGiOh. YuGiOh's deck uses the alternate art version of Dark Magician, which was also reissued a few days earlier as a Shonen Jump promo. This is because this particular artwork is based on the artwork of his Dark Magician in the manga. I'm not sure why the anime didn't use this artwork, but my guess is that the anime began production before this card was released. This is the artwork that was eventually released in the first TCG set, Legend of Blue Eyes, and instead of using this version of the TCG Yugi deck, they used the artwork that he uses in the anime. It all makes sense if you think about it and why it ended up the way it did. As you saw, these sets contained a lot of extremely good reprints. Dark Hole, Trap Hole, Monster Reborn, Change of Heart, and more. Those cards were previously not easy to get, so that alone made these decks great to have. Well, most of you guys probably realize what the important new cards were. First up is Waboku. This allows you to make the battle damage from your opponent 0 for the remainder of the turn. Unsurprisingly, Exodia made great use of this card. Morphing Jar is still the only counter to that deck. Next up is Last Will. This card broke the game. Its original Japanese text reads something like, if a monster of yours is sent to the graveyard this turn, you can put one monster with an attack strength of 1500 or less from the deck onto the field. And yes, it was as confusing in Japanese as it was and is in English. Basically, after you play this card, for the remainder of the turn, you can special summon a monster with 1500 or less attack from the deck anytime one of your monsters dies. There's no limit on this. You could repeat this as many times as you'd like. This card caused immediate problems. First of all, you can activate this card and then have Sangan or Witch of the Black Forest repeatedly slam themselves into the opponent and then summon themselves back. This allows you to search for all the Exodia pieces you need. That alone is an instant win, so much that if you played against an Exodia deck, you literally could not risk putting a monster in attack position. Gemini Elf is now useless. Morphing Jar is the only hope you have in a traditional deck. For anyone who has ever complained about Yu-Gi-Oh! At any point in the past, at least you were able to play monsters in attack position. Last Will also created an OTK with Cannon Soldier and a stupidly simple one that only requires 3 cards. Have Cannon Soldier and another monster on the field and activate Last Will. Then repeatedly use Cannon Soldier's effect until you win. The only reason this wasn't as popular as Exodia is because it requires having at least 16 monsters in your deck. Technically though, you could easily play an Exodia Cannon Soldier OTK deck if you wanted, and that is just disgusting. That's right folks, the Exodia deck is now perfected. The only way to defeat it is in a mirror match. And if you're in a mirror match with an Exodia deck, you'd better hope you go first because you could easily win on your very first turn just by drawing a ton of cards. Here's a December 1999 Exodia deck. This is Exodia at full power. What do you guys think? Does this have a chance to beat a modern deck going first if these cards are allowed to work according to the original rules? Let me know in the comments.
The end of 1999.
For the first ever Jump Festa, an annual exposition sponsored by the publisher of the various Jump magazines, some promotional materials were released. Attendees were able to receive a secret rare Blue Eyes White Dragon in its original artwork. In addition, Premium Pack 2 was released here. It reprinted the prize cards from the first Duel Monsters tournament, but this time it's actual ritual monsters. Previously, they were normal monsters and their cards were made of steel. Naturally, they all got ritual spells too. Black Luster Soldier is now the best ritual monster, but still not worth playing. And that's that. 1999 was an extremely interesting year for Yu-Gi-Oh! The game actually changed a lot, and cards have already begun to become stupidly powerful. It's a shame that the year ended with the metagame being so terrible. I think the 1999 format could legitimately be good with a custom ban list. I'm looking forward to seeing what the year 2000 brought to the table. Till next time.